Jack Reynolds never thought he could hate Christmas, but the holiday that once filled his family's home with warmth and joy had turned into a cruel reminder of loss and pain. In the small town of Cedar Hollow, nestled deep in the snow-blanketed woods of Maine, the season was marked by sparkling lights and cheerful carols, a stark contrast to Jack's solitary existence. For years, he had withdrawn from the world, retreating to his secluded cabin, far from the festive buzz of town. The snow fell heavily that Christmas Eve, silencing the world outside and erasing any trace of life. To Jack, the snow mirrored his own soul, cold, unyielding, and suffocating. His only companion was Max, a watchful German shepherd with piercing eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond his years. Jack had rescued Max during a tour in the Middle East, an unlikely bond forged amidst chaos and destruction. Over the years, Max had become more than just a dog. He was a lifeline, a presence that anchored Jack to the world when he might otherwise have let go entirely. While Jack avoided the townsfolk and their incessant cheer, Max was the one soul he allowed to breach the walls he had built around himself. That evening, Jack sat in his worn rocking chair by the crackling fire, a half-empty glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the flames. Shadows flickered across the cabin walls, briefly illuminating the framed photographs he could no longer bring himself to look at. Among them were pictures of his wife, Laura, and his son, Danny, their smiles frozen in time before that fateful Christmas Eve years ago. Jack's gaze lingered on the floorboards, as if they held the answers to questions he didn't dare ask. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint echo of something Jack couldn't quite place. Max stirred from his spot near the fire, ears perking up as if sensing something beyond the storm. At first, Jack dismissed it. Wild animals, perhaps. But then the dog stood, growling low in his throat. Jack frowned, his soldier's instincts flaring to life despite years of disuse. "What is it, boy?" Jack muttered, setting his glass down as Max trotted to the door, his body tense and alert. When the dog barked sharply, the sound slicing through the storm, Jack reluctantly pulled on his boots and heavy coat. He opened the door to a blast of icy wind that stole his breath, but Max bolted out into the night without hesitation. "Damn it, Max," Jack called, but the dog was already disappearing into the swirling snow. Grabbing a flashlight, Jack followed, muttering curses under his breath. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he trudged after Max, the beam of his flashlight barely piercing the blizzard. He couldn't help but think about the irony of this moment. After years of avoiding connection, here he was chasing a dog through a storm because he couldn't bear to lose the one companion he had left. Max's barking grew more insistent, guiding Jack toward a steep ravine near the edge of his property. When Jack reached the top, his flashlight beam caught the glint of metal, a car, partially buried in snow, its front end crumpled against a tree. Jack's stomach tightened. He scanned the scene, heart pounding, until he spotted a figure slumped in the driver's seat. "Jesus," Jack muttered, carefully descending the icy slope. He slipped once, catching himself on a branch, and cursed under his breath. Max was already at the car, pawing at the door and whining. When Jack reached the vehicle, he found a young woman unconscious behind the wheel, her face pale and bloodied. Her hair, dark and tangled, clung to her cheeks. Jack tried the door, but it was jammed. "Hang on," he muttered, though she couldn't hear him. Using a crowbar from his cabin that he'd brought out of habit, he forced the door open, the metal groaning in protest. Cold air rushed in as he reached in to check her pulse. It was faint but steady. "You're lucky, lady," he murmured, carefully unbuckling her seatbelt and lifting her from the wreckage. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was limp, dead weight in his arms. Max barked sharply, as if urging him to hurry. The climb back up the ravine was treacherous, but Jack's determination kept him moving. By the time he reached the cabin, his muscles burned, and his breath came in short, visible bursts. He laid the woman on his old couch, brushing snow from her clothes and assessing her injuries. A shallow gash on her forehead bled sluggishly, but otherwise, she seemed unharmed. Max paced nervously, his eyes fixed on the woman. Jack fetched a blanket, wrapping it around her, and then set to work cleaning the wound. His hands moved with a precision honed in war zones, though it felt strange to use those skills again. As he worked, the firelight cast long shadows, making the cabin feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. Jack glanced at Max, who had settled near the couch, his head resting on his paws. "What did you drag me into, boy?" Jack muttered. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling louder, as if the world itself was protesting. Jack leaned back, staring at the woman's face. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with delicate features that contrasted sharply with the violence of her circumstances. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this remote corner of the world on Christmas Eve. As the hours dragged on, the woman stirred faintly, letting out a soft moan. Jack's heart leapt, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, but he quickly tamped it down. This was just another person, another life he had to keep alive, if only until the storm cleared and he could call for help. But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this night was just the beginning of something far bigger than either of them. And as Max lifted his head, ears twitching at some unseen signal, Jack felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Not from the cold, but from the unshakable sense that their fates had just become irreversibly entwined. Ella stirred as the first light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Jack sat across the room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and watching her cautiously, as though her very presence threatened the fragile balance of his secluded world. Max lay at her feet, his ever-watchful eyes flickering between her and Jack, as if he were a mediator between two strangers bound by fate. When Ella finally opened her eyes, her gaze darted around the room, her confusion evident. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice raw from the cold and exhaustion. "You're in my cabin," Jack said flatly. "You had an accident. Max found you." Her brows knitted together, and she winced, touching the bandage Jack had applied to her forehead. "An accident?" Her voice faltered as fragments of the previous night began to resurface. "You're lucky to be alive," Jack added. His tone was curt, but there was a flicker of concern beneath his gruff demeanor. "What the hell were you doing driving in a storm like that?" Ella hesitated, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket that Jack had wrapped around her. I didn't know it would get so bad," she said quietly, avoiding his piercing gaze. "I was trying to get away." Jack raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. He'd seen that look before, people running from something, often without fully understanding what they were leaving behind. He turned his attention back to his coffee, muttering, "Well, you're here now. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. You'll have to stay until it clears." Ella nodded weakly, her body too drained to argue. As silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire, she studied the cabin. The room was sparse but functional, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with faded photographs. Her gaze lingered on one picture in particular, a young boy, beaming as he held a red sled, with a woman standing behind him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "That your family?" Ella asked hesitantly, pointing to the photo. Jack's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the coffee mug a little too hard. He said, his voice cold. "They're gone." Ella immediately regretted asking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her sincerity cutting through the tension. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Jack interrupted, standing abruptly. He walked to the small kitchen area and busied himself with mundane tasks, his back to her. Max shifted uncomfortably, sensing his master's unease. Ella decided not to press further. Instead, she turned her attention to Max, reaching out a tentative hand. "You're a hero, aren't you?" she said softly. The dog's tail thumped lightly against the floor in response, a faint sign of approval. As the day wore on, Ella began to regain her strength, though Jack remained distant, his words clipped and his interactions limited to practical necessities. He provided her with food, extra blankets, and occasional medical care, but his emotional walls were impenetrable. Ella, however, wasn't one to give up easily. "I'm Ella, by the way," she said later that evening as they sat near the fire. Jack didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Jack," he replied after a long pause, his tone begrudging. Thank you for saving me, Jack. And Max, of course, she added with a small smile, scratching the dog behind the ears. You didn't have to do that. Jack shrugged. Didn't really have a choice. Max wouldn't leave me alone until I followed him. Ella chuckled softly, though Jack's lack of humor was palpable. Still, I appreciate it. I owe you both my life. Silence fell again, but it was less suffocating this time. Ella sensed there was more to Jack than his gruff exterior suggested, though she knew better than to push him too hard. Instead, she began to share bits of her own story, hoping to bridge the gap. I was driving to Cedar Hollow, she said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. I'm a musician. Well, I was supposed to be. My family had this whole plan for me. Conservatory, orchestras, perfection. She let out a bitter laugh. It was suffocating. I needed to get away, start over somewhere quiet. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Cedar Hollow's quiet, all right. Too quiet for most folks. That's what I was hoping for, Ella admitted. I figured a small town might be the perfect place to find myself again, to remember why I started playing music in the first place. Jack didn't respond, but Ella noticed the slightest softening in his features. She decided to change the subject, sensing he wasn't ready to open up about himself yet. What about Max? She asked. How did you two find each other? Jack's gaze flicked to the dog, and for a moment, his eyes softened. Found him in the Middle East, he said, his voice quieter now. He was a stray, hanging around our base. Scrawny little thing, but tough. Saved my ass more than once out there. Ella smiled. Seems like he's made a habit of saving people. Jack didn't smile back, but there was a faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. Yeah, he's good at that. That night, as the storm raged on, Jack found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting to Laura and Danny. The photo Ella had noticed earlier seemed to haunt him, the boy's smile a painful reminder of everything he had lost. He heard the soft creak of floorboards behind him and turned to see Ella standing there, wrapped in a blanket. Couldn't sleep either? She asked softly. Jack shook his head. Storm's too loud. Ella hesitated, then sat down across from him. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here. Jack stared at her for a long moment, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't shared his story with anyone in years, the weight of it too heavy to bear. But something about Ella's presence, a stranger who carried her own burdens, made him wonder if it was time to let go of the silence. I lost them, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My wife and son. Christmas Eve. Car accident. I wasn't there. Ella's heart broke at the pain in his voice, but she didn't interrupt. She simply listened as Jack recounted the events that had shattered his life. For the first time in years, the words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, leaving him feeling both exposed and strangely lighter. I stopped caring about Christmas after that, he admitted. Stopped caring about a lot of things. Ella reached out, her hand resting gently on his. I'm so sorry, Jack. No one should have to go through that. Jack nodded, his throat tight. Max, as if sensing the weight of the moment, patted over and rested his head on Jack's knee. The warmth of the dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. As the fire burned low, Jack realized that something had shifted. For the first time in years, he had let someone in. And though he didn't know what the days ahead would bring, a small part of him felt the faintest flicker of hope, a feeling he thought had died long ago. The storm showed no signs of letting up, the howling winds creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere around the cabin. Jack and Ella settled into an uneasy rhythm. Despite the tension in the air, they found ways to coexist. Jack maintained his guarded demeanor, but Ella, with her gentle persistence, began to peel back the layers of his hardened exterior. Yet, for every inch of vulnerability Jack showed, there seemed to be an equal weight of unease growing between them, like the storm outside was a reflection of something brewing within. Ella spent her time exploring the limited space of the cabin. One evening, as Jack repaired an old kerosene lamp, she wandered over to the wall adorned with photographs. She studied each one closely, noting the transitions from happy family portraits to Jack in a desert landscape, camera in hand, surrounded by soldiers. Her gaze lingered on a picture of a boy clutching a red sled, the same boy from the photo she had asked about earlier. "That's Danny, right?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack froze for a moment, the tool in his hand poised midair, before he nodded. "Yeah." Ella hesitated before asking, "Did he like sledding?" Jack's lips twitched in what could have been the ghost of a smile. "Loved it. Snow days were his favorite. He'd wake me up at dawn just to get out there before anyone else." The warmth in his voice faded quickly, replaced by the weight of loss. Ella didn't push further, sensing the fragility of the moment. Instead, she traced her fingers along the edge of another photo. One of Jack holding a camera, his expression serious, almost haunted. "You were a photographer?" she asked. Jack replied, his tone clipped. "War photographer. Took pictures of things most people wouldn't want to see." Ella tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Is that how you ended up with Max?" Jack nodded, his gaze distant. "Found him during a patrol. He was a stray, half-starved, hanging around the outskirts of a village. One day, he ran into a building just before it blew. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here." Ella smiled faintly. "Looks like he's been saving lives ever since." Jack didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, crossed his face. A few nights later, Max began behaving strangely. He paced the cabin, his ears twitching and his gaze fixed on the door as if he sensed something beyond the storm. Jack dismissed it at first, assuming Max was simply restless. But as the dog's agitation grew, Jack couldn't ignore it. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Jack muttered as Max barked sharply, his tail stiff and his posture tense. Ella watched from the couch, her brow furrowed. "He's been doing that a lot, hasn't he? Like he knows something we don't." Jack shrugged, but unease crept into his voice. "Probably just picking up on the storm. Dogs are sensitive to that kind of thing." Max barked again, this time moving to the door and pawing at it. Jack sighed, grabbing his coat. "Fine. Let's see what's out there." Ella stood as well, pulling on a spare jacket Jack had lent her. "I'm coming with you." Jack hesitated, but relented when he saw the determination in her eyes. Together, they followed Max into the night, the dog's path cutting through the freshly fallen snow. The storm had calmed slightly, allowing the flashlight beam to penetrate the darkness, but the bitter cold bit at their exposed skin. After several minutes of trudging through the snow, Max stopped abruptly, barking at a specific patch of ground. Jack frowned, kneeling down to investigate. His gloved hands brushed away the snow, revealing a small wooden box, weathered and worn by time. "What the hell is this?" Jack murmured, prying the box open. Inside, he found a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, and an old photograph. He held the photo up to the light, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of Laura and Danny, but they weren't alone. A man Jack didn't recognize stood beside them, his arm draped casually over Laura's shoulder. In his other hand, the man held a violin, an instrument that looked eerily familiar to Ella. "That's impossible," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "That violin. It looks exactly like the one my grandfather used to have." Jack turned to her, his expression dark. "What are you talking about?" Ella took the photo from him, studying it closely. "My grandfather had a violin just like this. He always talked about how it was a gift from someone important, but he never said who." Jack's grip on the flashlight tightened. "What does your grandfather have to do with my wife and son?" "I don't know," Ella admitted, her voice small. "But this can't be a coincidence." The discovery of the box marked a turning point. Over the next few days, Jack and Ella pieced together the fragments of their respective pasts. The letters revealed a connection between Laura and Ella's grandfather, a friendship that had spanned years and continents. But there were darker undertones, references to disputes, secrets, and an unnamed threat. One letter, in particular, stood out. Written in hurried, panicked handwriting, it warned Laura to be careful who you trust and mentioned a Christmas gift that had been stolen. Jack's heart pounded as he read the words, his mind racing. "What gift?" he muttered, more to himself than to Ella. Ella, meanwhile, stared at the letters with wide eyes. Do you think this has something to do with the accident? Jack's jaw tightened. He had spent years believing the crash was a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate. But now, doubt crept in, insidious and unrelenting. Could someone have caused it? And if so, why? The answers came sooner than either of them expected. As the storm finally began to clear, Jack spotted unfamiliar footprints near the cabin, a sign that someone had been watching them. That night, as he and Ella reviewed the letters again, the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow reached their ears. Max growled low in his throat, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jack grabbed his rifle, motioning for Ella to stay behind him. Whoever's out there, show yourself, Jack barked, his voice carrying through the night. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a shadow emerged from the tree-line. A man with a weathered face and a look of desperation in his eyes. He didn't speak, but the gun in his hand said enough. You shouldn't have dug it up, the man said finally, his voice rough. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. What are you talking about? The letters. The truth. It should have stayed buried, the man snarled. Ella gasped, clutching Jack's arm. Who is he? I don't know, Jack muttered, his mind racing. But deep down, he knew the man was connected to the tragedy that had upended his life, and that the answers he sought might come at a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. As Max growled, ready to defend his pack, Jack realized that the storm outside had been nothing compared to the one now raging inside his heart. The truth, long buried beneath layers of pain and snow, was finally breaking through, and it was darker than he ever could have imagined. The man's presence in the clearing was like a shadow dredged up from Jack's nightmares. His gun was steady, his face etched with years of bitterness, and his words carried a weight that chilled Jack more than the winter air. You've been digging where you don't belong, the man growled, his gaze darting between Jack, Ella, and the letters clutched in Jack's hand. That box was meant to stay hidden. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, his voice low and firm. Who are you? What do you want? The man scoffed. The name's Henry Brooks. I was a business partner of your wife's father. Let's just say there's a lot you don't know about the people you loved. Jack's chest tightened, the accusation twisting in his gut. What the hell are you talking about? Henry smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. Laura's father and I, we had a deal. That violin? Worth more than you'd ever imagine. I planned to sell it, but her old man decided to give it away. Said it was a symbol of peace or some crap like that. His gaze darkened. When he refused to play ball, I made sure he paid for it. And when Laura got involved, well, I had to send a message. Ella gasped, stepping closer to Jack. You caused the accident. Henry shrugged, his face impassive. I never meant for it to get that far. Just wanted to scare her. But things got messy. His expression turned sharp, the regret replaced by menace. And now you're stirring up things that should have stayed buried. Jack's hands shook as rage boiled inside him. He had spent years drowning in guilt, believing he had failed his family, only to learn that their deaths had been orchestrated by this man. The revelation struck like a lightning bolt, electrifying his every nerve. Max growled low in his throat, his body poised to spring. Jack raised a hand, silently commanding the dog to stay put. Why come back now? Jack demanded. After all this time? Henry's gaze shifted to Ella, his lips curling into a sneer. She's the loose end. If she starts digging into her grandfather's ties to that violin, the whole thing unravels. Can't let that happen. The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity, the winter air crackling with tension. Then, Henry lunged forward, his gun rising. But before he could act, Max leapt into motion, a blur of fur and muscle. The dog slammed into Henry, knocking him off balance, his gun firing wildly into the air. Max! Jack yelled, rushing forward as the two struggled in the snow. Ella screamed, diving for cover behind a tree as Jack raised his rifle. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. Henry collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg where Jack's bullet had struck. Max limped back to Jack's side, blood staining his fur. Jack dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he inspected the wound. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're okay. Stay with me." Ella emerged cautiously, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "What do we do now?" Jack's gaze hardened. "We're going to finish this." Jack and Ella dragged Henry back to the cabin, where Jack secured him to a chair, tying the ropes tightly. Henry cursed and spat, but Jack ignored him, his focus unwavering. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Jack and Ella sifted through the remaining letters and documents from the wooden box, piecing together the final threads of the mystery. The truth was devastating. Laura's father had been caught in a web of greed and betrayal, his generosity with the violin, a priceless Stradivarius, making him a target. Henry's resentment had festered for years, culminating in a calculated act of sabotage that claimed Laura and Danny's lives. The violin itself, once believed lost, had been hidden away by Henry in his desperation to cover his tracks. Ella's connection to the story became clear as well. Her grandfather, a recipient of the violin's symbolic gift, had been an unwitting participant in the tragedy. The family's fates had been intertwined by Henry's greed, their shared pain buried beneath layers of snow and time. "I can't believe this," Ella whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All these years, my family had no idea." Jack clenched his fists, his anger tempered only by the weight of what had been revealed. "Neither did I. But now we do. And we're going to make it right." As dawn broke, Jack called the local authorities using an old satellite phone he rarely touched. Within hours, the sheriff arrived, his face grim as Jack recounted the events. Henry was arrested, his protests falling on deaf ears as the evidence piled up against him. The box of letters and the photograph of Laura and Danny, with Henry in the background, were enough to seal his fate. But for Jack and Ella, the resolution brought little comfort. The scars of the past couldn't be undone, and the truth, while liberating, carried its own burden. Max lay on the couch, recovering from his injuries. Jack sat beside him, his hand resting on the dog's head. "You saved us, boy," he murmured. "Again." Ella joined him, her presence a quiet comfort. "What now?" she asked. Jack stared into the fire, his thoughts swirling. For years, he had lived in the shadow of his grief, but now, with the truth exposed, a new path lay before him. "We rebuild," he said finally. "For them. For us." Ella nodded, her hand resting on his. "Together." That Christmas Eve, as the storm finally cleared, Jack stepped outside for the first time in days. He carried a small bundle, a wreath he had made using pine branches and a red ribbon. Ella followed, holding Max's leash as the dog hobbled along beside her. They walked to the edge of the property, where a lone tree stood, its bare branches reaching toward the sky. Jack hung the wreath carefully, his breath visible in the cold air. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, a tribute to Laura and Danny, and a symbol of hope for the future. Ella pulled out her violin, which she had managed to salvage from the wreckage of her car. She played a soft, mournful melody, the notes carrying through the stillness of the forest. Jack closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but undeniable sense of peace. As they stood together beneath the pale light of dawn, Jack realized that Max had been right all along. The dog had led him to Ella, to the truth, and ultimately, back to himself. And though the pain of the past would never fully fade, Jack knew he had been given a second chance to heal, to forgive, and to let the light of Christmas shine once more. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.